So I am back again. This is my second video, and I'll try to keep it to just 3 videos. And as I was saying, this video will look back to some of the history behind this subject. Mainly I've spent a lot of time reading the first section of a collection of writings. The collection is called The Expanding World of General Relativity, and the first section is The Search for Gravitational Absorption in the Early 20th Century by Mr. Roberto de Andrade Martins. Anyway, as some of my audience, I suspect, may think, the hypothesis of gravitational absorption may have been dismissed 200 or 300 years ago, but you could see for yourself that even as late as the 1920s and 30s, there was, or perhaps the 1910s and the 1920s, there was still some serious debate about it, especially as it regarded lunar theory and lunar eclipses. If there is gravitational absorption, it would occur more significantly during a lunar eclipse than during a solar eclipse, both of which are probably the most significant instances in which it would occur at all within our own solar system, apart from or along with the eclipses of the Jovian satellites and the satellites of the other gaseous planets. But of course, for those, they are much further away from the sun, and the eclipse for them is not quite as significant as it is for our own moon. As I was saying, with the theory of the motion of the moon, we have this question of absorption coming up in the early 20th century, because there were fluctuations in the motion of the moon which were still unexplained by Newtonian theory at that time. A couple physicists, one by the name of Hugo von Seeliger and one of his students, Kurt Bottlinger, they were two of the key players in asking that question, whether there was some kind of gravitational absorption during a lunar eclipse, and whether that absorption could help explain those fluctuations in the motion of the moon. Now, William Campbell, this is a quote from him. Well, he was famous for the role that he played in one or two of the eclipse expeditions for testing relativity. He was somewhat notorious, rather, because he almost took the stance that the eclipses did not confirm relativity. Well, if you know the story, then you know the story, but Martins wrote about Campbell that he regarded Bollinger's work as a competitive solution of the problem of lunar theory. Campbell himself wrote, Kurt Bottlinger and Willem de Sitter have recently investigated the hypothesis that the mutual gravitational attractions of two bodies may be influenced by the passing of a third body between the first two. There is some evidence that this hypothesis is an approximation to a fact of nature. Campbell wrote that in 1913. But over the following few years, or next couple of decades, it became increasingly difficult to defend the hypothesis that there was any gravitational absorption during eclipses because, well, for several reasons. But one of the last defenders of that hypothesis was another American astronomer. Bottlinger was not American. Campbell was. But the other American of whom I speak is a naval astronomer, and that was Thomas Jefferson Jackson C. But he seemed to do some fabrication of data when he tried to defend the hypothesis himself, and in Martin's historical account, we are told that, quote, C's work was rejected as groundless. Its apparent success was due to the use of Simon Newcomb's empirical data, And instead of improving Bollinger's work, it probably helped to decrease the interest of astronomers on the subject. The account also goes on to say that the theory of relativity, also arising in the early 20th century, overshadowed this, and it's not surprising that this lesser-known inquiry into the nature of gravity, the inquiry regarding absorption, should be overshadowed, because obviously Einstein's inquiry about relativity had more success. That's why it's more widely known. But I would like to insist that perhaps that's not enough reason to dismiss the inquiry into absorption altogether, as the historical account from Martins does show some respect to it and to the likes of Bollinger. On the last page it says, quote, "It is not so easy to understand why Bollinger's explorations were dismissed or did not receive much attention. They were high-quality work, but were simply not linked to the mainstream of gravitational research of the time. Their motivation was an old-fashioned corpuscular or wave theory of gravitation, and that style of theory had been replaced. Although very popular among outstanding scientists at the end of the 19th century, now it had been replaced by another kind of theory." The inquiries from Bollinger did not fall on fertile ground, necessarily, because of the rise of relativity. And obviously, it's not that simple. There were some good reasons the hypothesis of absorption did not catch on so well. But as I've already been trying to say, I think there could be revisions to Bollinger's version of the hypothesis, namely the revisions I suggest. Nothing too elaborate or in too much detail, but just an inquiry as to whether the subject of heat can be brought into this hypothesis. I want to ask whether we can methodically test a thermodynamic theory of gravitation. And what I mean by that is, like I said, about lunar eclipses chiefly, there was the concern as to whether they had anything to do with explaining certain strange fluctuations in the motion of the moon. Well, during lunar eclipses, the sun's heat is also inhibited from reaching the moon, as any kind of Newtonian gravitation might be. So the temperature or heat content of the moon is changing out of the ordinary, the ordinary state of equilibrium, I suppose. And I'm wondering if that has any effect on the moon's gravitation toward the sun, and namely in the changes in that gravitation. Before I go on with this idea, though, it would be fitting to say a little more about the fluctuations in the motion of the moon which I've been talking about, and how these fluctuations never seemed to have been fully explained. This, I think, offers some justification for questioning the theory of gravity in the same way Bollinger and a select handful of other physicists were questioning it just prior to the rise of relativity. We must, however, add something to the approach, and can hopefully do so in a way which will turn out to be compatible with the fundamentals of the theory of relativity. And I will say more about that in the next video.